in the United States because he was adept enough to play the media. When Mueller's report was released, and Bill Barr wrote his own summary of the report and released that to the press. And the press accepted it because they thought, yeah, you couldn't possibly be lying. You couldn't possibly hope to conceal the content of a report that at some stage, surely it will mostly be released to the public. Well, a lot of that report was redacted, and the steam had gone out of the reporting because all of the newspapers had already run with the headline of no collusion. Mueller finds no collusion, no conspiracy. So I'm grateful to the man who made this TikTok because he's been able to use a lot of contemporaneous headlines from that time. It was really frustrating. For those of us who had been following the story intently, we knew Barr was lying. There was no question of that. But to see the mainstream media suck up what was put out by Barr, suck up that story that nothing to see here, Trump's been completely and entirely exonerated, that was frustrating because we knew most people weren't paying as conscientious and thorough attention to the various unfolding revelations about involvement between various Russians and the Donald Trump campaign, so that we knew there was enough details to thread together a narrative of a shadow campaign being run, a parallel secondary secret campaign being run on Donald Trump's behalf by Russians with the involvement and with the instigation of or assistance from Trump's campaign manager and deputy campaign manager, as well as his close friend and confidant, Roger Stone. So yeah, we knew, and we've had to live for years with the effects of the media credulity. Now look, even if the media hadn't swallowed that story hook, line, and sinker, it still seems likely that Republicans would have still refrained from convicting Trump. It feels as if there weren't enough people of principle in the Republican Party to get to the number needed to have a 2/3 majority of the Senate kick Trump out of office, which would have prevented the significant portion of the over 500,000 lives that have been lost to COVID, to say nothing of the ongoing fallout, the vaccine reluctance of Trump followers, the utter devastation to the economy that is now also manifesting itself in crime now that people are emerging from lockdown and there's elevated rates of crime. And Republicans will use those details to spin a narrative of Democrats are at fault. Their indulgence has created more crime. I don't know. How do they attribute it to Democrats? They'll say Democrats are soft and Republicans represent strength. They represent the power of intimidation. If you have Trump telling police officers to bump people's heads against police cars when they're being put in, that whole "don't be gentle" speech that Trump gave to police officers, it'll be there was clearly a sentiment that was what backing the blue involved, taking police officers off the leash of any compulsion to be gentle and respectful. Basically, we're tired of the Constitution, and we're tired of constitutionally mandated protections of people who are merely suspected of a crime. Hey, Let It Be's here and says, hello, Let It Be. Nice to see you. So I will bring up Twitter on screen and see if we can watch that TikTok. Let's have a look. So this is created by someone called Matt Negrin. He's from The Daily Show and he's blocked by Meet the Press. Oh, that's not surprising. He's very scathing of Meet the Press. He's got 60,000 followers. That's good. He says, here to remind you, Sean Spicer is a liar. I don't think he really is host of Hardball at 7 p.m. on MSNBC. I think that's wishful thinking. Oh, and I'd like to take a moment as well to celebrate the fact that Darnella Fraser, her journalistic achievement has been recognized by the Pulitzer Prizes. Yes, she's a teenager with a mobile phone who stood there for 10 agonizing minutes while someone was murdered in front of her. While she still attempted to plead for his life, she had the fortitude of presence to keep her camera steadily trained on what was happening. And that video was so devastating in its potency, in indicting not only Derek Chauvin, but indicting society, any societal contribution to the level of confidence Derek Chauvin felt that he could murder a black man in public and face no consequences. That belief was written in his body language, was written in the casualness with which he knelt on George Floyd and kept his feet even off the ground. He was the senior officer in that setting, and he also inspired his fellow officers to keep kneeling on Floyd's back. All things which were creating positional asphyxia as a man begged for his life and eventually died as a consequence of deprivation of oxygen, leading his brain to just shut down. And even then, Derek Chauvin didn't cease from kneeling on Floyd's neck, illustrating that his commitment to defying the general public, his commitment to defying the standards of decency of the general public, that was shaming for everybody capable of feeling shame when you see a police officer is so confident that he is thoroughly supported in his actions, that people are so willing to assume police officers are acting in good faith, and that he has institutional backing. And when we looked at that confidence and then felt compelled to know more, why would a police officer feel so confident in his assumption that he would get away with murdering someone in front of witnesses, in front of people using video recorders? You realize, oh, police have qualified immunity. And many police unions have won certain rights that allow them to withhold video evidence from their cameras, from their body cameras for certain periods of time. They're allowed to collaborate with each other and get their stories straight before being interviewed. They're allowed to take meal breaks and snack breaks. They're allowed a plethora of options that help them circumvent the rule of law. And that idea of elevating police officers above the rule of law, because it illustrates that it was too much, that respect for police officers has swung too far in their favor and has contributed to the emotional composition of monsters, of a monstrous disregard for the safety of citizens, and that effect is particularly pronounced with regards to Black American citizens. But white American citizens have also died at the hands of police officers, because police officers have, in a general sense, gotten out of control with mental characterizations of the public as enemy and the police force as an army, a self-contained army that has internal integrity and strong opposition to the rest of society because they're potentially enemies. And I would argue that America's overly lax gun culture contributes to that, because it contributes to police officers being afraid for their lives. Comparatively speaking, it's not the riskiest profession in the world, but there is a lot of awareness of risks that police officers face. The death of a garbage collector might go relatively undiscussed by the press or undiscussed by television shows and news reports, but police officers know that some of their colleagues have been lost to violence contained within their jobs. Violence that is unnecessarily high because too many Americans have been persuaded to latch on to a false premise. The premise being that more guns means more safety, when the reverse is true. it was a misinterpretation of the Second Amendment for Justice Scalia to maintain that the Second Amendment was all about personal protection, because it's not. The Second Amendment opens with the phrase, a well-regulated militia, because it's in reference to a well-regulated militia, that America originally, when it was founded, couldn't afford to pay soldiers within an army, and so instead had a volunteer army, which was a well-regulated militia, or ideally a well-regulated militia, and that the Second Amendment consolidated the strategy of allowing that army of volunteers, that militia, to equip themselves to purchase weapons for use in this volunteer standing army, or this volunteer army. And so that mischaracterization of the Second Amendment has been done through conservative judges being appointed to their position on the Supreme Court bench, because Republican presidents have been able to attain office even when losing the popular vote multiple times, because of a baked-in affirmative action system baked into the Constitution, benefiting conservative white people who owned slaves and land. Slaves that they used to farm land and avoid the hardships of manual labor, and were able to rationalize that as being religiously sanctioned and therefore morally and ethically sanctioned, and continued to cling to those rationalizations even when abolition made it legally untenable to continue to have slaves, to continue to enslave human beings. Sometimes the human spirit is stubborn and people will find a way. So, of course, the 14th Amendment was used to continue to enslave humans and deprive them, or generate significant profit off their coerced labor. And the 14th Amendment, of course, is that provision that you can not have slaves unless they are in the prison system, at which point you are allowed to compel them to work for essentially no financial reward. Oh, Marsha's here. Hello, Marsha. Lovely to see you. All right. This is still looking a bit fuzzy. Why is it fuzzy? I'm going to put it back on. I introduced Matt in a grin before, but I didn't follow through with clicking play. So we'll play it and see how.
Here's how Trump's Attorney General Bill Barr manipulated the media because they took him at his word when he was lying. First, Robert Mueller delivers Bill Barr the Mueller report, and it says Trump is guilty. Instead of releasing the report, Barr makes one small change.
At least you can hear the audio.
That should do it.
He writes the word "not" in front of
And instead of making it the
guilty.
Mueller report, he also renames it the Mueller report summary.
Yeah.
Barr says, here's my memo about the Mueller report, and gives it to the press. Normally, when an official gives something to the press like that, the press has to attribute it so that you know where it comes from, and you can make a determination whether that person is telling the truth or not. But instead, the press just took him at his word. Mueller finds no conspiracy. Mueller finds no conspiracy. No conspiracy is found. No collusion. No collusion. No collusion. Bill Barr is a liar, and he should be treated like a liar. So now that he's back in the news for lying about something different, why the fuck are we writing stories about him and interviewing him as if he's not lying to you? Here's how Trump's Attorney General Bill Barr manipulated the media because they took him at his word when he was lying.
So
first, Robert Mueller delivers Bill Barr the Mueller report, and it says Trump is guilty. Instead of releasing the report, Barr makes one small change. That should do it. And instead of making it the Mueller report, he also renames it the Mueller report summary. Barr says, here's my memo about the Mueller report, and gives it to the press. Normally, when an official gives something to the press like that, the press has to attribute it so that you know where it comes from, and you can make a determination whether that person is telling the truth or not. But instead, the press just took him at his word. Mueller finds no conspiracy. Mueller finds no conspiracy. No conspiracy is found. No collusion. No collusion. No collusion. Bill Barr is a liar, and he should be treated like a liar. So now that he's back in the news for lying about something different, why the fuck are we writing stories about him and interviewing him as if he's not lying to you? Here's how Trump's attorney...
So that was a very effective TikTok. I think bringing the teens on board is a good idea. So it looks like the Department of Justice watchdog is going to investigate Trump-era efforts to secretly subpoena data from Democratic lawmakers. Wow, what a mischaracterization to just say efforts, though, because they didn't just make efforts, they succeeded. They subpoenaed Apple, and then they also imposed a gag order so Apple couldn't tell its customers who were being spied on. Adam Schiff, Eric Swalwell, and their family members, including at least one minor, and their legislative aides as well. They were being spied on vengefully by Trump via his unethical Attorney General, William Barr, and his unethical Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, who signed off on the gag orders. For Apple, Apple was gagged, and recently the gag order was not renewed by a judge because Barr is no longer in office, Rod Rosenstein is no longer in office. So Apple informed Schiff and Swalwell that they and their families had had their metadata handed over to the Department of Justice. So it's Justice Department Inspector General. Well, now I want to know, is the Justice Department Inspector General a Trump appointee or a new appointee, a Biden appointee? Oh, okay, so it's Michael Horowitz. Michael Horowitz has announced the opening of an internal probe into the department's Trump-era secret subpoenas against Apple for data belonging to House Democrats and their family. The fact that it was family as well, I think, is important to include in these stories. It's only an extra 2 words, and families, but just so people can fully comprehend how egregious these subpoenas were, how much of a violation of privacy and a violation of the rule of law, that these people were so contorting the law to say, yes, we're investigating, we've got a judge to sign off on this. The Department of Justice should go after Trump's enemies on the basis of leak investigations. So we don't like people leaking to the press, so we're going to compel mobile service providers to hand over private details. So it is quite an extraordinary revelation. Not that surprising to those of us who have argued for a while that Trump was fascist and a fascist rallying point for people who were already inclined to fascism, so that fascism sucks people in and they will comply with things that normally they would feel constrained to not do. Fascism is like a snowball of enthusiasm for wrongdoing. Hey, that's a good sentence. I'll write that down. Because fascism is not governance through competence. Fascism is governance by legitimizing people's id, which it is a Freudian term. And so I'll quickly go through the 3 Freudian terms. Under Freud's assessment of human nature, you have a superego, which is your conscience. So we could just call it conscience, a conscience that says, do the right thing, don't draw the wrath of society down upon yourself, adhere to standards, be good. And your id is your more primal self that says, do what you want, that has more animalistic rages, that goes, I need food, I'll do anything to get food and safety, and I'll respond to threats. So the id might say, be violent, and the superego might say, hang on, let's just evaluate that threat. Does it really need violence in this instance? So there's a dialectical tension that gets aroused when people might feel that too many women have had power in society. Women are often socially assigned to be the keepers of conscience, to say, hey, are we looking after the children? Are we doing the right thing for society in general, and making sure we don't get too carried away with hyper individualism? So when women succeed in gaining power in society, sometimes there's a backlash from people who say, hey, we need more of those manly attitudes, because men are sometimes socialized to be more indulgent of their id, of their primal selves. because we as a society have habitually delegated to men the duty of being violent in a society's defense, of going to war and taking orders and shooting people designated as enemies, even if they don't personally feel much like killing other people. They just do it because they're told to. And that's changed. It's changed. It's no longer exclusively men in the military. We no longer have conscription. Nixon is kind of a manifestation of that under-regulated id, of just doing what he wanted, being very self-serving. Now, ids get hungry for recognition and power after the power of a surprise attack. So the 9/11 attack certainly intensified a lot of people's resolve to get away with shouting down people of compassion and people who want to step back and look at the big picture and what's best to do. They're like, no overthinking anything. We just have to go in and attack everybody as a deterrent to anybody else trying to attack America by surprise and alarming all of us with pictures of our tallest buildings collapsing and people losing their lives in the most horrendous, frightening, painful ways. That shock to the system does have an influence at a cultural tide moment. So people applauded George Bush for not buying into the id ravenously immediately. He said, we have to be sensible. We can't give in to hate. We can't let them win. We continue to hold our head up high, and we won't be Islamophobic. Or we won't just indiscriminately blame people who share some element, some commonalities with the attackers. So he made some responsible sounding noises, but fundamentally he unleashed the dogs of war on the country of Iraq, knowing that he would have significant buy-in from American citizens in a broad sense, because people would have these abraded feelings of having been attacked. And not everybody supported the war. There were thousands of marches against the war, arguing these are just rationalizations. You're just trying to throw America's weight around. You're just trying to get oil. And certainly there were people advising George Bush who had stakes in Halliburton, who did intend to profit from the millions and billions that flow into any given scenario when you instigate a war. So yes, 9/11 changed a lot of things, and the fallout from the emotional fallout from 9/11 is still obviously influencing current events, even though it's been now 20 years. And a new World Trade Center has been built, and 100,000 Iraqis have died as a consequence of the military conflict in the Middle East instigated by George Bush, bringing along with him soldiers, thousands of male and female soldiers, thousands of whom lost their lives, British or United Kingdom service members and Australian service members, all of whom fought in this war and who lost their lives in a cause of essentially showing sympathy to the US and showing sympathy to the US's goal of demonstrating military might as a punishment and a deterrent to anybody who might contemplate future terrorist attacks on the US, on US soil. That was the unspoken premise, but the spoken premise was weapons of mass destruction, which, as it turns out, didn't exist, and they probably knew they didn't exist, and a lot of motivated thinking went into running with the assumption that they existed. And there were financial motivations for some of the people involved in making those decisions. They benefited personally. There was the emotional reward of being the person who elected to do something when upset people who lean towards the xenophobia of the id, wanted to see people attacked in a retaliatory sense, people whose sensibilities are more conditioned by the Old Testament and its violent responses to conflict. The Old Testament does have a lot of slaughtering of tribes in order to defend various other tribes. I'm not a big reader of the Old Testament, but as far as I understand, there's a lot of bloodshed in them, a lot of vengeful behavior, and God recommending that people salt the earth and perhaps spare the lives of some of the women, but take them as wives for yourself, and enslave other people. And that happens in the Old Testament. And there are a lot of people who still adhere to the Old Testament as a pivotal text that should not only inform their own lives and their own morality, but should inform government. And those religious people are more likely to be dominant in rural areas, and people in rural areas where a form of theocratic Christofascism is still quite dominant are more likely to vote for Republicans, and their votes count more than the votes of urban people in urban areas. They carry a disproportionate weight above the actual number of people because of how the Constitution was written and because of the motivations of the Founding Fathers. The motivations of the Founding Fathers, many of whom were slave owners themselves, but the motivation to ensure slave owners could be brought to the table to participate in and to validate the founding documents of this new nation of the United States. And the concessions that were made to them were that they could have a thumb on the scale of power in the United States. So everybody's been lied to about why the Electoral College exists. The Electoral College exists to reassure slave owners that abolitionists would not gain so much power that they would be able to outlaw slavery. The Electoral College gives a weighting to states that may have large land size but had high slave populations and relatively smaller voting populations than urban areas, and that whenever that urban-rural divide in an ideological sense gets particularly pronounced, that is when conditions are ripe for an overturning of the results of the popular vote, which is democracy. The popular vote is a democracy. It's predicated on the ability of a majority of people to see through a con artist or to see through someone whose strength is more performative rather than real, to see through a leader who will drag you into war unnecessarily, who will drag your economy into a recession, who will drag people into harm's way whilst they themselves benefit. And that's what we can see has happened with multiple Republican presidents, not just Trump, but also George W. Bush, who lost the popular vote, but who won the Electoral College vote that everybody in America is conditioned to accept on the grounds that it's just fair. It's just balancing out the influence of big states with little states, as if somehow big states represent big people and little states represent little people, so we have to watch out for them because fair's fair. Little states aren't populated with little people that we have to act protectively towards because they're so little, and we can't allow might to be right. It's false to characterize big populations as mighty. They're just people, so they have a lot of votes. And in democracy, you're trading off that assumption that a majority of informed people can oust a tyrant or can exclude a tyrant from office. But those little states are not little people, they are low population people whose votes then disproportionately count for more than the voter from an urban area, meaning that those people understand that they're being spoilt and they rationalize it to themselves that their votes are better and more worthy and that they are deserving of more influence. So it's kind of a breeding ground for narcissistic entitlement amongst voters from small states as well, who are like, yep, those uppity urban people, our votes should definitely count for more than theirs. And it feeds into a very persistent dynamic across American history of white people who've enslaved Black people, made fortunes as a consequence, and gained geopolitical influence around the world, become part of America achieving superpower position in the world, and then saying, yes, well, it's divinely ordained. There are religious justifications because we are, as white people, inherently superior and Black people lack something. Even as there are laws passed to forbid Black people from learning to read or owning property or having the autonomy to leave or to be paid or to have families that are allowed to maintain integrity and stay married and raise children together. Children instead could be sold away from their parents, and the injustice and the immorality of that creates a schism in reality for people who continue to try and paper over the immorality of those actions with a fabricated rationale of a racial hierarchy of merit. So that's my perspective on the Electoral College, and I will keep trying to explain to Americans that an extra effort has to be made in America to counteract the influence of white rural Christian voters, because they do feel like they have been crowned king of the United States, and they do often continue to maintain a patriarchal view of society in which obedience is more prized than creativity, and you have to be very suspicious of outsiders. People from small towns will often tell you that they're lovely to you if you're established as one of them. And if you move in, and they can just tell, even if you used to live there, you've moved away for a few years and you come back, you are tainted with outsiderness. And they view cities as being degenerate, apocalyptic wastelands. And they believe the disinformation propaganda that they're fed repetitively and routinely by news organizations such as Fox and OAN. They lie to them about what California's like. They lie to them about what cities are like. They lie to them about the value of creativity in society. And they continue to act as if all of the problems of society are a function of growing disobedience in the young. And the failure of parents to value obedience as a key organizing principle of parent-child relationships. I've bought into that at sometimes and gone, okay, so I should work to help my children be obedient. It works with skills that I think my husband learned in an MBA course, that things work better when you have the consent of the governed. And you can always try and ratchet up your power and authority in order to compel obedience. But cooperation is actually a more productive way to live as a family. Sweeties, thank you so much for, okay. Yes, cooperation is better, because then also your children are more likely to internalize the values you teach them. And God willing, no, that's a Christian. Touch wood. I'm a good Jewish girl. I'm just facetiously making the sign of the cross there, because it's something I do care a lot about. I do hope my children, I'm managing to successfully transmit values that my children will perpetuate in their own lives, but also that they will become good finders out of their own values, and they will listen to their conscience, and they will seek to feed their conscience with good information and not succumb to propaganda. And I'll point to Finland for that, because Finland's education system apparently has a way of incorporating critical thinking skills into all aspects of their school curriculum. So in maths, you might learn about statistics with an eye to being able to internally counter propaganda arguments that use statistics to try and deceive you. So Finland is less likely to have huge pockets of vaccine refusal, or less likely to subscribe to QAnon, the QAnon cult, which is a cult that has international penetration. Marsha says we need that in our school curricula. Well, that's something for me to write down, because do you know what helps me get up every morning is finding things where I go, where I say to myself, do you know what? Any ability that I have to communicate with others or to engage with others can be harnessed to that task. So I collect tasks. So the task of trying to help the United States schooling system emulate Finland in that laudable element of critical thinking. Because I've long disagreed with the argument that it's mere lack of education that creates conservatives or creates conspiracy theorists on the right or the left. I have long been of the idea that well-educated people can be Nazis and can succumb to that idea that we need strength. The lure of strongman arguments that can affect people who are educated, but over time, once you've had a strong man in power, and if they've had a crisis that they've failed to deal with, and that they've actively added to harm and they've compounded harmful circumstances, then you do have some peel off of educated people who have some mental reserves to pull back from the emotional manipulation of a strong man who says, without me, your cities will fall to ruin. Joe Biden will destroy the Bible and he'll kill God. Educated people can pull back and say, wow, those arguments do seem kind of extreme. And they also experience some unease when they hear contradictory arguments. And that is part of not education, but people who have skills in critical evaluation department. I've heard of engineers who think Trump is the bee's knees, and they're very educated and they have great skills with mathematics and design and physics, etc. But they weren't capable of analyzing Trump in a historical context to say, oh, wait, that's what con artists do. They make an emotional appeal to safety. They say you're in danger from migrants, you're in danger from this stigmatized group. They use very threatening, they use language including lots of descriptions of threats to amplify any pre-existing perceptions of threat, just as Hitler in Europe built up on pre-existing community suspicions of the outsider looking Jewish people, to include even Jewish people who were very thoroughly assimilated into German society. They too became objects of suspicion under Hitler, who repeatedly accused Jews of conspiring against Germans and sabotaging Germany's role in World War I. You guys being good, darlings? Is your friend with you? My son's friend isn't supposed to have any more screen time today. So they've been playing Uno, and they wrote a poem, and they're going to do some other things. So Finland, on list of goals, make arguments to emulate critical thinking elements of Finland's school curriculum. Critical thinking, because there's going to be a fight over school curriculums are the new battleground right now. You have parents demonstrating. They're essentially whipped into how's it going, darling? Good. Essentially whipped into a fervor by Tucker Carlson and people of that ilk who say children will be corrupted if they're taught critical race theory, which critical race theory is critical theory with the word race introduced into it, because critical theory was initially a theory that excluded considerations of racial history. Somebody pointed out on the internet that white privilege is when your history is mainstream curriculum and my history, for someone who is Black, is an elective. So it's something you can choose to do to learn about Black history. It's not a critical part of what happened in the United States. And that's not how things should be, because when you don't understand the commitment that various white people have exhibited across American history to so organizing American laws and American institutions to gatekeep Black people out of power and out of wealth building opportunities, to deny them government-backed mortgages, to build freeways over Black dominant districts, to ensure that they couldn't easily travel to work, that they couldn't get jobs because they could only work locally, because they were literally bypassed by highways. So they still received a lot of the environmental side effects of this particular form of transport. Their children still got to inhale lead from car exhaust before lead was outlawed as a component of petrol, and gas, as you call it in the US. When you don't understand that about America, when you don't understand that Black returning service members from World War II were excluded from opportunities that had been promised to all service members, but ultimately were delivered only to the white service members, the white soldiers who had risked their lives in the service of American interests and the interests of democracy at an international level. Marsha says you must get involved in the PTA right away. Yes. In my journey with the resistance and with what Americans have tried to encourage each other to do, it's often been, write to your senator, write to your senator. And if your senator's Republican, all of your letters and all of your pleadings would have fallen on deaf ears, because Republicans were working quite cohesively together during the Trump years to consolidate their power as a political party, to keep supporting Trump, because he was a very effective rallying point for white supremacists. And they realized it wouldn't cost them, even when Trump was nakedly hostile to ethnic minorities. Once they realized he could and did win the election of 2016, they just tailored their positions to ignore Trump's tweets, to say to reporters, oh, I haven't seen that tweet, or I don't engage with those type of things. They could continue to pretend they had a veneer of support for democracy or support for standards of civility, whilst rejoicing in Trump's ability to turn out low propensity voters, to engage low propensity voters. That is to say, people who don't really follow or care about politics, but they do enjoy the feeling of empowerment of reflexively contrarian politics and racistly oriented contrarian politics. So politics that says, I defy political correctness, I defy expectations. The left didn't expect me to win, but I did. How triumphant of me. Trump's very victory was something that attracted a lot more people to him, which explains how he managed to expand on the number of votes he attracted from 2016, when he was viewed in the mainstream media as a likely losing candidate, to 2020, when he had built on that base, turned out a lot of low propensity voters, and scared a lot more voters still into thinking that COVID was pretend, but that if they elected Joe Biden, they would be punished with lockdowns to deal with a fabricated crisis. So people that believed Trump about that definitely added to his high total of votes, but that still couldn't beat the 7 million higher vote total of Joe Biden, who had a coalition of support from very motivated Black voters who understood that they were being that they were the targets of a soft genocide, that Trump's callous inaction with regards to COVID, and that Trump's sabotage of what would be a normal government response to a pandemic, to prepare, to have a testing strategy at a national level, to use federal government resources to seek to contain the virus or to minimize it, instead of just using it as a self-promotion argument that it wasn't real and he was the only person prepared to tell you the truth about it, not COVID not being real, and then switched to saying, I'm the only person who'll tell you that COVID is a plot from the Chinese government. In both cases, he's still fueling off people's pre-existing conviction that Trump is capable of inverting expectations, that he's a truth teller because he's a disruptor, that people didn't expect him to win, but he knew the truth, he would win. Well, the truth he knew was that he was collaborating with the Russians and had, unlike Hillary Clinton, a secondary campaign, a secret secondary campaign of Russian assistance, as established now by a bipartisan Senate committee that have admitted, yes, a Russian intelligence officer, Konstantin Kilimnik, was receiving data from Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, and Trump's deputy campaign manager, Rick Gates, that at the Havana Bar in Trump Tower, which Jared Kushner owns, they handed over printed out copies of GOP internal polling data with reference to Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, key battleground states for winning an electoral college victory, because Russia understood you can't make Trump win the popular vote. A lot of people know he's has a temperament that's unsuited for politics. He's a vainglorious, self-aggrandizing guy who ripped off a lot of people, but that there's a vein of popular sentiment that could be enough, particularly given the thumb on the scale of the rural vote that is a function of the electoral college system, a thumb on the scale of rural vote, and that to rural people, the otherness of migrants and Trump's willingness to make migrants a scapegoat for crime. So crime is not principally committed by migrants, but Trump's implies that it is. Crime is not something that native-born, that America-born what's another word than native? Because it sounds too much like Native Americans, but I mean people born in America commit, proportionately speaking, more crime than any type of migrants, be they documented migrants or undocumented migrants. But Trump gives vent to the unthinking id. Trump legitimizes an id approach, and an id approach is what you use if you feel weak. An id approach is what you use when you want to abandon the constraints of civilization and you want to lash out. You want to just find a target and hit it, even if it's the wrong target, because you want to show strength and deter your enemies, because you are taken over by that feeling of weakness. And rural Christian people, or people who identify as strong, evangelical, Pentecostal Christians, feel under attack by modern culture. They feel under attack by the embrace of gay rights, by the acceptance of gay marriage, and they do feel under attack by societal moves. Oh, hello. I'm still here, but I don't know if you can see me. So, there I am. Okay. I was briefly kicked off. So theocratic Christian people who want to end the separation of church and state, who have a whole rationale of why the Bible should be used in government. The Bible should be used to govern Americans. They felt like that argument was losing, and it was for good reason. And people, the plethora of information associated with the rise of the internet has been eroding some of the religious convictions of people. It's harder to keep people away from information when computers become a way of doing business and paying your taxes. People are attracted to computers because they're attracted to money, even if their religion says, we'll stay away from those newfangled things that will teach your children to think that being gay is acceptable. So religious conviction is shrinking, but religious determination to take over government is increasing because it's increasingly desperate, it's increasingly determined, and these people have been planning for decades. Roger Ailes responded to Nixon's downfall by creating the Fox News network so that it wouldn't happen again. The public would never again hear the truth as comprehensively as that about a president's misdeeds. Fox just doesn't report on scandals associated with a Republican president. It just ignores it, or it lightly touches on it and drowns it out with other stories. Oh, you can see me. Thanks, Marsha. All right. What else do I have in my bookmarks for you? So the Department of Justice, we've covered that under Trump, it demanded metadata. Oh, no, we haven't covered how many. The Department of Justice under Trump demanded metadata on 73 phone numbers. Let's have a look. This is reporting from Jim Scuto, who is a CNN anchor and chief national security correspondent, and author of a book called The Madman Theory, Trump Takes on the World. I don't enjoy Trump being called a madman because to me, it individualizes Trump, whereas Trump exhibits behavioral patterns associated across history with power-hungry So madness is just sometimes a descriptive term that we use when we can't relate to other people. And yeah, that's my argument with that approach. But yes, Jim Scuto, oh, dang it. Did you guys hear me just then? I don't know if you heard me say that I had an argument with the premise that Trump was a madman because we describe people as mad when we can't relate to them, but we also can't accept that they're just different to us. We have to stigmatize them as mad. So Trump, to me, is not mad. He is governed by different principles. He's governed by acquisitiveness rather than conscience. So his acquisitiveness makes him want to grow in influence and power and money. I would imagine money, but any signals of status, any state signifiers of status and privilege. People want to feel special. Yes, he's cunning. He's not particularly informed in a way that adherent to the belief, the ideology of meritocracy would like. So people thought he wouldn't be president because he wasn't well educated. He couldn't speak in an impressive way about foreign policy or economics. But other people don't subscribe to meritocracy, and they say Trump has the signifiers of merit in a consumerist sense. He is wealthy. So that is the trapping of success that they look to, not how he spoke, not how he showed knowledge, not how he evinced understanding of any given topic. They liked his simplistic understanding of any given topic because it allied with their yearning for an unleashed id, for a more primal response to things, to say, America first, me safe, you unsafe. Trump's willingness to embrace violence was a signifier to frustrated conservative people that, yes, you don't have to worry about the type of civilized constraints that some people have been arguing for a long time. You feel like you've just had to accept society changing when you didn't like it. So you've been victimized by modern society, and now here is your opportunity for redress. So everything that Trump said was worthy of cheers by people who understood at some level that their votes have a disproportionate power in the American political system. Christopher says Trump is governed by the Mercers and Putin, who are both very cunning and don't give Trump more credit than he deserves. True, I would agree with you that Trump is heavily influenced by powerful billionaires, including Putin, who is a very powerful and duplicitous billionaire, as well as an adversarial foreign leader. But an effective manipulator of racist people. He can empathize with them and understand them because he is quintessentially a Fox News viewer. He's obsessive audience of Fox. He watches them and he learns from them and he builds on what they do. And that is a way to build political support, to reinforce what people are already hearing from one source, to support and expand on the narratives that that source is telling them, because that's how you get established as common sense. When you deliver something that is repeated, that is delivered from more than one source, so they don't just have to evaluate your credibility, they understand that there's a raft of credibility because they've heard that there's a caravan of migrants threatening American lives from Fox News. They've heard it repeated by Trump. They've heard it validated from Trump's spokespeople and from OAN and Newsmax and Sinclair News Stories. It becomes an unchallengeable truth to them. So the more it's an unchallengeable truth to them that they're threatened by migrants and only Trump has the resolve and the strength to protect them from that threat, the more impervious their brain becomes to information that Trump is in fact putting them in danger and that his actions are endangering them, because that truth does not gel with the profundity of their convictions that only Trump is willing to go out on a limb to protect them from these true threats that nobody else will tell them about, but Fox tells them the truth and Trump confirms that truth, that the main threat to American prosperity and security is migrants and Black Americans. You can see that they are primed to believe that Black people threaten their safety and security because of their response to the protests. Now, some data was released yesterday saying that, yes, the George Floyd protests were predominantly peaceful and didn't destroy property. But Fox News ran every night with footage of things burning. Some of those fires that were lit by white accelerationists, people who are white supremacists, who believe that a race war is inevitable and like to kickstart actions to precipitate what they see as an inevitable race war that they would like to initiate on their own terms. So white people initiated some of the property damage associated with George Floyd protests. Some of the protesters, a small subset of the protesters, were violent looters and damaged property. But to Fox News audience, all of the protesters are looters and violent. They are primed to accept the worst about a minority group that they stigmatize with gay abandon. So they will continue to assert that they need to be protected, not just from Black Americans whom they fear, but they will latch on to things that are a proxy for race discussions. So they will latch onto the idea of critical race theory, because then they don't have to say the word Black or that they're afraid of Black. They can say, I'm afraid that critical race theory will be taught to my children and that people will compel them to be ashamed of being white. People will compel them to be apologetic for being white, and that will depress my children and make them become communists who don't want to participate in modern society. For them, it's a slippery slope. If you learn the truth about history, you will want to invert society so that Black people can occupy all the positions of power and enslave and beat and exploit white people in a Old Testament style form of justice where historical wrongs are righted by recreating and inverting past practices. And that is a phobia of people who amplify threats. And as much as we say, hey, your fears are ridiculous, they start with a nugget of concern that's based on reality. Sometimes teaching people real history does have to be done carefully, because children can get depressed if you tell them white people suck. Even when it's true that some white people across history have sucked really badly and have been exploitative, venal, avaricious, immoral people who've done immoral things for hundreds of years and have amassed great intergenerational wealth as a consequence, and that intergenerational wealth is still helping some people have cushy lives now, whilst other people suffer because their families don't have that built up intergenerational wealth, not just because their exploited labor was used to create the intergenerational wealth of others, but also white sabotage has broken in at various points since slavery ended to burn black property, to withhold benefits from returning black service members, to use taxpayer money collected from both white and black taxpayers to make high quality schools for white children and run down facilities for black children. So a theft, a government sanctioned resource theft from working black Americans. It does have to be managed with an eye to that, just to say, to not depress children. And this is something actually that maybe Black Americans won't be able to relate to, is that there is some degree of shame, and you have to work out how to sublimate that shame or to counterbalance that shame. Racist people want to say, well, don't learn history in the first place, and then you won't have to worry about your children being ashamed of what they're associated with and what their ancestors are associated with. But white people have to worry about it. How do we teach people history honestly, which they need to know so they can make well-informed decisions about which kind of racist, manipulative con artists are trying to get into your voting pants by reassuring you that everything you've ever believed is true, that your false beliefs about racial hierarchies of merit are true. That's how people get you. And I remember that from a boy who once successfully pursued me, not because he was so wonderful in himself, but because he had a talent for noticing people's emotional vulnerabilities. He had a talent for noticing what someone might believe to be true about themselves, but what they weren't entirely sure was established as true. So he would tell me that I was very intelligent and insightful. Smart thing to do, because I suspected I might be intelligent and insightful, but I wasn't sure that I was right, and I wasn't sure that other people thought so, and I wasn't sure that I'd done anything with my life to make it obvious or make use of any intelligence or insight. So that boy evoked substantial loyalty on my part for him, so he could manipulate me very effectively, because he identified an unmet need for validation. People like to have their ideas about themselves confirmed. So for people who want to think, I'm not wrong about the world, I haven't been taught anything wrong by my church, white people are more superior. So we haven't done anything wrong across history, because we have merely acted on our superiority. We have merely enslaved inferior people and grown to be a geopolitical superpower as a consequence of that, generating great wealth from enslaving people because we could, because we won, because we're better. So we don't have to worry about the immorality of that, or the moral repercussions, or should reparations be paid? Was it a terrible thing? We don't have to worry about that. It was the only thing that could be done because we're so innately superior. And people who have those views have increasingly felt that they are being frowned upon by modern society, where it's become less and less acceptable to show you agree with the construct of white innate superiority. And Trump heard that feeling because he's also a Fox viewer, and he knows that people felt looked down upon, and that people would feel triumphant and celebrated if he could but reinforce their views and confirm their views to them. You're right, he told them. Mexicans are migrants, criminals. Mexicans are rapists. Imagine the incredible rush of happy feelings you'd get if you thought society was on a unchangeable trajectory towards condemning you as a racist and as someone who was wrong. People don't just not want to be shunned as racist, they want to be right. Donald Trump told them they were right. He confirmed their views. He said, Fox News tells you 100% unvarnished truth, and I will do that also. And they're like, yes, I believed Fox News, and now you're confirming that I was right all along to do that. Imagine the loyal bonds that you create amongst a group of people whom you have reassured that you are right. So that's the most fervent of Trump supporters, people who will never forget how great they felt when Donald Trump confirmed everything that they had ever believed. And then also imagine the complicity of Republicans who didn't think Trump was that great and who did think he might have a tendency to lean towards racism, but thought, well, he's businessman who's successful, so he will accrue benefits to the American economy, and I will vote for him as a consequence. Maybe I will hold my nose and vote for him. And then maybe over time, I'll continue to read the media detailing instances of potential corruption, and I'll believe Bill Barr when he says Mueller has vindicated Trump. And I'll say, oh, Trump has been so picked on. And a subset of those people, those uneasy Trump supporters, have said, Trump first said the virus didn't exist and he didn't have to do anything to mitigate against it because it was a phony threat. And then he said it was a very real threat, but he still didn't have to do anything because what he just had to do was stand up for our right to blame the Chinese government. That made even some Republicans uneasy enough to win Joe Biden an electoral college vote, as well as the popular vote victory. Enough to overcome the substantial advantage that accrues to rural Christian voters, rural conservative Christian voters, through the weighting given to relatively low population states that lost some of their population when slaves were freed, but didn't lose much of their voting population because Black people already couldn't vote in those states. Molly's here, and Molly says hello. Hello, Molly. Nice to see you. When I saw that TikTok video that I showed earlier, it did make me think, Bob's been asking me to go on TikTok. And that, yes, I do need to work with people. Maybe I'll meet some people in Boston who have editing skills, or maybe I'll do an editing course online so that I can learn how to produce TikTok videos, because it does seem like a very efficient way of communicating ideas to people. Now, I've been talking for an hour and 8 minutes, which means I will get off this broadcast. Thank you so much for listening. And am I going to sing today? Haven't really rehearsed the Try Not to Get Worried song, but that was a song I wanted to sing.
Try not to get worried.
Try not to turn on too bright. I'll just drink a little bit first. I've been talking for an hour. All right, let's do it.
Try not to get worried.
Try not to turn on to problems that upset you. Don't you know everything's all right? Everything's fine. Want you to sleep well tonight. Still a bit high for me. I must have transposed it to sing it to my children. Okay, can't sing it. Can't sing it, it's too high. I'll sing the cup song because you guys like that as well. In fact, no, I really want to sing something lower. Oh, what about Dear Theodosia? I haven't sang that for ages. And that's something I used to sing all the time. And then we'll go. Dear Theodosia, what to say to you? You have my eyes, you have your mother's name. When you came into the world, you cried, and it broke my heart. I'm dedicating every day to you. Domestic life was never quite my style. When you smile, you knock me out, I fall apart, and I thought I was so smart. You will come of age with our young nation. We'll bleed and fight for you. We'll make it right for you. If we lay a strong enough foundation, we'll pass it on to you. We'll give the world to you. You'll blow us all away. Someday, someday. Yeah, you'll blow us all away. Someday, someday. Ooh, Philip, when you smile, I am undone. My son, look at my son. Pride is not the word I'm looking for. There is so much more inside me now. Ooh, Philip, you outshine the morning sun. My son, when you smile, I fall apart, and I thought I was so smart. My father wasn't around. I swear that I'll be around for you. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll make a million mistakes. The world's safe and sound for you. We'll come of age with our young nation. We'll bleed and fight for you. We'll make it right for you. If we lay a strong enough foundation, we'll pass it on to you. We'll give the world to you. Blow us all away. Someday, someday. Yeah, you'll blow us all away. Someday, someday. There you go. So thank you, Marsha. She enjoyed it. Bless you for asking me to sing, you guys. I think I shared with you the other day this comment from someone who said, oh, I totally disagree with everything she says. It's leftist propaganda, blah, 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 blah. But I like hearing somebody say things I disagree with. And also I enjoyed the singing. And I thought, okay, I had always thought of the singing as something that might please my regular listeners, but would potentially repel other people. And it's lovely to be able to think of that particular creative outlet as a possible inducement for return viewers, so that I can hone my craft of appealing to people and increasing a critical mass of people who are committed to and and give credence to the idea that you have to counter propaganda and stand up for a functional democracy in which people can vote in a way that maximizes their collective ability to get justice, to get a proportionate share of government services, to have a government that is functional and doesn't drag the economy into a pit and doesn't unnecessarily drag the country into war, and who can be a strong leader in a crisis and can be a strong leader before a crisis to organize resources such as the pandemic response unit that Trump disbanded, etc. Christopher Lucas says, "My singing soothes." So that's a beautiful compliment, and I'm grateful. It's very nice. I think I have sometimes upset people with my singing in my own family. So it's nice to know that maybe I've improved my singing enough that I have created an audience that finds it to be soothing. So I'm so glad. It's very emboldening at a creative level. And I'll go and try and think more of some lyrics of songs that maybe I can tweak to fit current political moments. Oh, Knowledge is here. Hello, Knowledge. And yes, TikTok. Maybe TikTok is something I'll try and do when I move to the US, and maybe changing song lyrics and just finding ways to keep getting information out, because decent people have to be alerted to the need to defend democracy. That even though we ousted Trump from office, the Republican Party is still building on Trump's achievements in eroding democracy. They are still using his ability to deceive his supporters about the integrity of the last election to claim that changes need to be made to the election system, changes that will cheat Republicans into a position of advantage. And when I say cheat the Republicans into a position of advantage, I mean disenfranchise a majority of Americans. All right. Bye, everybody. Take care.